Let's see. All right. Hello, everyone. This is Rob Orson with the Emerging Revolutionary War. We're back with our Rev War Revelry and leading up to the 250th anniversary of Lexington and Concord coming up in the spring, this April. Very happy to have Matt Beres with us tonight from the Arlington Historical Society. Matt actually was a big part of our annual bus tour that we did just a few months ago. And I have to say, Matt, I'm not sure if I told you this, but of all the surveys we got, the Jason Russell House was like the highlight of the entire weekend. So
Oh,
we
that's thank you.
appreciate you and your good team of volunteers there to host us, and it's such an amazing resource. And that's what we're going to talk about today is a little bit about Menotomy, which is now modern day Arlington, Jason Russell House, and let Matt talk a little bit about all the great work that the Arlington Historical Society is doing. And really encourage everyone to go visit up there, if not for the anniversary, either before or obviously anytime after. So thanks, Matt, for joining us. I appreciate it.
Of course, thanks for having me.
So Matt, we're gonna just kind of have you give a really brief 30,000 foot background of of what's going on April 19th. I know you have an interest in Concord, so if you want to start in Concord and work our way back, and then we can dive into the story of what's actually happening there around the Jason Russell House.
Right, yeah, absolutely. So just to, I guess, provide the overview of sort of everything that happened leading up to the Battle of Lexington Concord and Menotomy on April 19th, 1775. We all know the story of the Boston Tea Party with the increase of taxes on British goods. So you have tea, stamps, you have really a whole slew of objects that the provincials and the colonists, for lack of a better word, we'll say, have really gotten upset because one of the most underrated things that we don't necessarily talk about a lot is the influence of from the French and Indian War. The British, as we know, the British Parliament felt that the French and Indian War was something that the colonists need to pay for because it was their war that they started, of course. And right before that, they felt that the colonies, at least the Massachusetts Bay Colony, was more of a sort of a sovereign entity, still part of the British government, but rather sort of a separate running institution, I will say. And so that caused a lot of civil unrest with the local communities, especially in Boston. And so what happened was a few individuals, like just naming names, like we have Dr. Joseph Warren, Sam Adams, John Hancock, they all got together with all the delegates from the local towns and sort of tried to create their own Congress. This is the Continental Congress before we have the Provincial Congress, which was, of course, about a year later. And so they all get together and they meet in different areas throughout 1774, that time period. They meet in Concord, they meet in Cambridge, and so on. And they sort of discuss, what they should do in the event that the British regular armies would go in and disrupt their sovereignty and such. And this is right after the passing of the Intolerable Acts, which was in response to the Boston Tea Party. And it did a number of different things, like it shut off the Boston Harbor. So no money was going in, no money was going out. People were getting their houses foreclosed on. People were losing their jobs. It also reinforced the Quartering Act. Of course, we have one of our amendments in the Bill of Rights because of that. And it sort of it was a collection of things that really upset the general population. And so what the provincial or the continental or sorry, the provincial Congress, what they start doing is they start gathering supplies to sustain a standing army of about 15,000 or so individuals. They come up with the plan of the minute companies, and these are like your Navy SEALs, right? So they were get ready at a minute's notice. And they start gathering all of these supplies and sort of hide it out in the Concord area. And it's in the Concord area, meaning it's part of Concord, but also some parts were outside of town as well. And so, of course, General Gage, who's the governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony at that point, he gets word of this, and the story is this: he sends 700 of his handpicked best British regular soldiers of light infantry, but also grenadiers, to go in, get all these supplies in the conquered area, dispose of them, and hopefully suppress a growing revolution. And so, of course, we know the steps leading towards that with the shot heard around the world, started at the North Bridge and then ended all the way through Lexington, through Menotomy, present-day Arlington, and then back into Boston. So
That's a good overview of that. Not everyone can do it that quickly, so I appreciate that.
of course, I have some training on that.
Yeah, that's true. That's right. You do. So really quick, if you can just briefly talk about, and there's a reason why I'm doing this, talk about the area itself, just this area west of Boston, not just Menotomy, but also Concord. Like,
Yeah.
what kind of communities are these? Are they agriculture communities? Are they, what kind of communities are these? Because, it really plays into the role that some of these people are going to play on April 19th to talk about
Absolutely.
where they're from. So what kind of areas, communities are these?
Speaking for a minute for on the natural landscape,
Yeah.
there's a huge myth about how there was not a whole lot of farming here. I mean, relatively compared to down in Virginia or Georgia and those places. Um, but most of the area was almost all agricultural fields. People, especially in the Middlesex County, this area of Greater Boston, one of their main sources of revenue or just lifestyles, they were farmers. And so when Ralph Waldo Emerson writes the Concord Hymn, the farmers stood there and a shot heard the famous shot heard round the world, whatever that is. And he's talking about how these people, especially in the militia, are farmers, or they're blacksmiths, or they are some other position in a sense. But for the most part, these were really just farmers by profession wise. And we joke that a lot of the area was actually in Boston was all swamps back then. It wasn't until a little bit later, about 100 years after, during the 1700 time period, is when they started developing and expanding on their agriculture. And so we know there's a myth of what we know today of New England is being whole dense forests and rolling hills and everything. But really back then, it's very the landscape was very almost sort of like a grassland ecosystem. A lot of the area was mostly just clear. So in certain points when you go into Concord, and if you go to the North Bridge, you'd be able to see the entire town from the Bridge and vice versa. But of course, now today you can't really see that anymore.
Right. And we're talking small farms, right? Because, when you drive, even today, when you drive from Lexington to Concord, and the few houses that are still remaining, it's a good number. And these farms are pretty close together.
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely. Yeah, it's and that's mostly for a reason is because of the cold climate, relative to the cold climate over here. They're not big. At least starting out in the mid 1600s, you had farms from anywhere between 50 acres to maybe about 300 acres and such. But that would, of course, be later subdivided when, 1750 comes around and everything. So really, New England and especially Massachusetts thrived on these close towns and these close relationships with one another, which is why they weren't so spread out like you might see in other places throughout the country.
right. So for those of you who had never been there before, so how far away from colonial Boston is Concord, and how far is Menotomy, as far as geographically speaking?
Yeah. So we joke in New England, we always tell a distance by time. So
We do that
uh,
in DC too,
okay.
trust me, we do it here too.
Yes. So from Concord, with notorious Boston traffic, it's probably anywhere between half hour to about 45 minutes by car. So probably about a little over 20 miles, I will say. From Arlington and Menotomy, where we are now, it's probably closer to 20 minutes, maybe even 10 miles, if that. We'll get to this in a little bit, but we were known as West Cambridge. So we are quite literally we border Cambridge, right west of Cambridge.
Right. And so I bring this up because you talked a little bit about this. The Gage sends the regulars out. They have the early morning fight on Lexington Green, which they would say is a shot heard around the world, right? I won't get in the middle of the Lexington versus the Concord fight here.
Yep.
And then they go on the Concord, obviously Northbridge, have that significant action there, and then we start seeing that the column coming back toward Boston, toward Charlestown. And obviously, a lot of people know this story. The militias are turning out from all different towns around the area, even some, the next day coming from New Hampshire and other parts of New England. If you can just talk before we get into Menotomy, just talk a little bit about why do you think, I know you know a little bit about Concord, why do you think there's such an effective communication system, like thousands of people, right? By the end of the day, almost they say, 5,000 people are in Menotomy alone.
Yeah.
Which mean, like, how are thousands and thousands of New Englanders galvanized to rush to be involved in this action so quickly? It's
Yeah.
amazing when you think about technology, right? Like there is very little technology back then. So just in your opinion, why do you think they're so successful in turning out so many people that day?
Well, and a lot of that success stems from not necessarily just strictly from Paul Revere, but so many other people who have planned this in very extensively. And the myth is of Paul Revere bravely going independently and going to each town and raising the alarm. The British are coming, even though he probably would have said the regulars are coming
Right.
in that sense. But that whole system of the one if by land, two if by sea extended even further from Paul Revere. You had people like William Dawes came, Dr. Samuel Prescott, who raised the alarm in Concord, because of course Paul Revere got arrested just outside of Lexington. And so many more of these people that would go to their designated locations. And they would say, of course, go into different towns and say, go to specific people. And those specific people, probably selectmen or delegates or some captains of the Minutemen or or militia companies. And they knew what to do at that specific moment when they got that alarm. What's interesting about before I get into that, I wanted to talk. I know you mentioned about the feud about Lexington and Concord.
Right.
For those who don't know, the first shot of the battle really started in Lexington about 5 o'clock in that morning, and the reason why so many people might not say that is they shot her around the world. It's because, of course, Ralph Waldo Emerson, he lived in the Concord area, and he was specifically talking about the people at the North Bridge. But in Lexington, what happened, no historian really knows. I mean, there's, people can make predictions and everything, but no one really knows who fired that first shot.
Mm-hmm.
And I always tell people, does it really matter? Because tensions were already going to be at a breaking point where it was probably going to be, it's going to happen regardless. And so what happened in Lexington Green on the 5 o'clock in the morning is the 60 militiamen from Lexington, they blockade the road going to Concord. And of course, they are met with 700 of those British regulars. They're exchanging some pretty nasty words and such. And again, a shot just fired. And again, we don't know who started that. But the militia was ordered to disband and by their own officers. So as they're turning around, they were shot through a volley of fire from the British regulars. So the first instance of the provincials going on the offensive would have been the North Bridge. I will say, however, to end the whole feud, the shot heard around the world continued from from Concord at the North Bridge all the way into Lexington, all the way back into Menotomy at the Jason Russell House, and then back into Boston. And there's instances where there may have been other messenger riders who would go in and they might find specific militia companies or minute companies and tell them exactly where to go. However, some of them may not have actually made it to the battle itself. So I'm doing research in Wilmington, which is about north of Boston, a little bit west of Salem, yeah, probably Salem. And there's evidence of them having a minute company, but there's no evidence of them fighting in that respect. So again, history is a living thing. So it's
Right.
up to the historians to do the research and find these stories that we want to know more about.
Right. Yeah, it's still, it's still amazing the number of people that did turn out, right? Like it's
Yeah,
just yeah, on our tour we just did up there, that was like one of the things people had a hard time, like why how they know to come here, right? How they know? And I was like, this just goes to show that these people were organized, right? They were ready for something to happen.
yeah,
And there are a lot of other small events that lead up to this, Salem, Powderhorn. There's all kinds of things we won't get into now, but there's a lot of other things that were going on leading up to this that really prepared these towns and communities to be ready for this. And
yeah,
it's just a kind of an amazing story. So as this British regular column is coming back, and a lot of us know the story of Battle Road there, which is now the national park. Of course, I think the bloodiest part of Battle Road, as you know, is where you are right now, not in the national park. But their part is the preserved part, and your part's the developed part. But
mhm,
these regulars are getting constantly harassed by these militiamen, and I can only imagine, I always try to put myself in the shoes of one of these British regulars, right? Young person,
yeah,
very unfamiliar to this area, has been harassed for a long time in
yeah,
Boston and other places, and just the situation, they've been up all night the night before, they've made
yeah,
this long march, now they're making this long march back, they've been shot at. And they get to Lexington, and that's where I want to kind of pick up our story. They get back to Lexington on the way back east, and Percy's relief column is there to kind of provide them some support, which must have been a great relief. Um, but then I think as you move from Lexington into, going into West Cambridge and going back into Charlestown, things really get really bloody. And part of this, I think, just for me, and I'd like to hear your feedback on this, is, Percy does an order where he orders, most of the buildings alongside the road to be either torched or
mhm,
cleared, and you start to have soldiers going into these homes. And I think that's why I think this becomes such a personal thing between Lexington and
absolutely.
back into Charlestown. What do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you mentioned, so General Lord Percy, he's commanding the relief column, because of course, as you mentioned, Lieutenant Colonel Smith's column, they're tired. They've been up since 10 o'clock the night before. They didn't get their rations until much later. And only until when they get back into Lexington again, they able to take a break for that entire time. Um, and when they meet up roughly around 3:30 or so in the afternoon, they finally go back into Menotomy. And one of the biggest portion of battles happened at what's called the foot of the rocks. And there's instances and other stories out there, like I wanted to share briefly about, viewers may have heard of an old gentleman, about 80 years old, named Samuel Whitmore. And Whittemore, doesn't really matter. But he suffered a gunshot wound to the head. Provincial, of course. He suffered a gunshot wound to the head. And there may have been other descriptive details about how he was slain by the British regulars. However, he lived about 14 years or 16 years after that happened. And it's just sort of an interesting story about how much, he's an older individual, and he lived 14 years or so after that event happened. And that's something that's another story that we're trying to we can do a little bit more research on, and also sort of just shed light more about that. But again, as they get into Menotomy, it's again one of the fiercest portion of the entire battles. And as I mentioned before, Menotomy used to be Arlington. And so as you mentioned, Lord Percy is going and ordering people to go into these houses, into these individual residencies, and find snipers or marksmen, I will say, that might or may not be hiding into these houses and firing onto British regulars as they are coming back. Because, of course, the British regulars, they were marching in formation, street formation. And so when you have a whole bunch of almost 3,000, a collective of 3,000 provincial Minutemen and militiamen, they're firing on either side of you. It's pretty hectic, and not necessarily in the same manner as British regulars have trained previously. And so, again, he orders these people, these regulars, to go into these houses and find, again, those marksmen and such. And if there's no instances, he may have ordered them to burn or completely displace that entire property. There's evidence that we have from the Adams family, and it's not the same Adams family that you think. In Joseph Adams, he was a deacon of the First Parish Church in Menotomy. And he was a patriot. And the story with him is he thought that he was going to get arrested by the British regulars as they were coming back from Lexington into Menotomy. And so he leaves his house, and leaving his few kids and his wife, who just gave birth about a few weeks before this. And the story is that the British regulars, they storm into the house, they steal some silver tankards and other things like that. They also steal the inner workings of a clock, which we have in the Jason Russell house, the case, of course. And the story with that is then they rip a page from their family Bible, create a fire in their living room. And I don't know how true this next part is, but the kids had to take homebrewed beer and douse the fire just straight in their living room. But as you mentioned, like we like to think about both perspectives. Obviously, if you're a homeowner or if you're any member of the Addams family, you're pretty scared. But also if you're a British regular soldier, you're scared because you don't know where these individuals are hiding, and you don't know what to exactly look for. And there's a discussion about whether it's morally acceptable for them to do that. Probably not. But I'm always a fan of humanizing specific people in history and sort of getting different perspectives in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, if you're Percy and you're in command and you've been, the Smiths guys before Lexington have been dealing with people in houses shooting at you, I totally get it. And as that column's getting closer into Boston, it's becoming, there's more and more houses, right? There's
Yeah,
less farms or smaller farms. You get closer into the city. And the British column does have the flankers out as well, but it just, you're right, personalizing it and try to put yourself in their shoes. Yeah, it's definitely a horrible call to tell people to go burn people's houses, but you're getting
yeah,
shot from those houses. I don't know. I mean,
yeah,
it's a hard situation,
yeah,
but the Whittemore story is amazing too. You guys there along the route have the stone markers along the way, marking some of these sites, right? That's always interesting to me. You go up there and you see this memorialization of these events that took place throughout Menotomy. The Cooper Tavern, the Black Horse Tavern, foot over the rocks. All those really cool spots are marked there in the area, which is great for visitors when they come and see it. I know it's an older memorialization of the story, but I think it allows people to understand that something was going on there, on April 19th and why it's important.
absolutely.
I like the Cooper Tavern story. I mean, like's the wrong word here, but the two men that are in there and they refuse to leave, and Miss Cooper has the account afterwards of the two men were killed. They were stabbed. They were shot. Their brains were mangled, and it's just really a bloody thing going on through that area. Of course, some of this may be exaggerated by the Patriots, but what cannot be denied is the fact that people were being killed, right? And
Absolutely.
innocent people were being killed as well as the militia that were armed.
Yeah.
Um, and that kind of goes into what I want to talk mostly about with you is the Jason Russell House story
Yeah.
because I knew a little bit about it before coming up there for the tour. I've been there several times before the tour, but then just kind of reading more about it and hearing your story and your volunteer guides did a great job that day too, talking about how many people were killed in that house, how many weren't from Menotomy, and it's
Yeah.
pretty amazing. That part's pretty amazing to me. So before we go into what happened around the Jason Russell house, can you talk just a little bit about who Jason Russell was and his role in the community? I know there's some things saying he was somewhat handicapped. How much of that is true? And just go on a little bit about who he was.
Yeah, so Jason Russell, he was a farmer. He had an apple orchard, and he was a sheep herder. And so of course he would be considered a most likely a yeoman. I gotta double check my notes, but a landowning farmer. He the story is that he built this house starting as early as 1740, and with boards that he may have used from his grandfather's house.
Hmm.
So we've done a process, not to get into too much of it, but we did a process, a study called dendrochronology.
Mhm.
And it's essentially counting the rings on these boards, but taking on a whole different level. You take that, and you match it with the climate data of that time period, and then you match those specific growth rates based off of how much that tree has grown within those specific years. You take that, match it with other historical pieces of data to figure out, okay, we found that this is roughly around the 1600s time period. Match it with other family documents and records and other such. Then we figured that they found that a lot of the wood was actually from a mill and cut down and felled from as early as about 1680. So the boards that we have, at least on the interior, are a lot of them are from that time period. So it's probably one of the oldest things in existence. And of course, there are houses even older than that, but it's still pretty remarkable that that's still part of the original wooden planks. And I frankly actually have not heard of the story of him having a specific disability. I may have heard something about the fact that he may have had something, but
Like a limp or something, like I've read
yeah,
multiple accounts, a lot, some of the disability part's more of a modern take on it. I don't know if was he just older, right? I mean, that could have been it too, right? I mean,
yeah,
I don't move as fast as I did 20 years ago myself, right?
right.
So how old was he at that time?
That unfortunately I don't know specifically.
He was definitely older, I believe, from
Yeah, so I will say I started my position about 6 months ago, so I'm still trying to get into learning all this
there.
specifics. So my volunteers here will know a lot more about this and everything in much more bigger and in-depth detail than what I might be able to provide. So
So he's a small farmer, apple
yep,
orchard, sheep herder.
yep,
Really cool about the house, by the way. I didn't realize that. I didn't hear that part on the tour, but you kind of do so much on a tour, right?
yes, right.
So dendrochronology has the technology in dendro has gotten so much better in the last 20 years. It's pretty
Absolutely.
fascinating what you can find out. Um, so he somehow gets wrapped up into this fight. So talk a little bit about, how he gets wrapped up into this and why this house becomes a focal point, not just on April 19th, but really becomes a focal point in memory, right? And
Yeah, absolutely.
remembering April 19th and people that were involved.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's lucky about our house is that it's right off of Mass Ave. And it's the same road which used to be known as Concord Road, and it was the same road, the main road, in which you would take from Concord to Lexington all the way to Boston. And so having the house right next to this street made it so that when the British regulars came, it would be a major point of engagement. And so the story is that so many other provincials, Minutemen, militiamen from different towns, believe it or not, from Danvers, from perhaps from Salem, but mostly from that general area. Um, they take shelter into the Jason Russell House. So as we talked about, Lord Percy is going and ordering the British regulars and officers to go and search all of these different houses. And so what happens is while they're pinching the sides of the relief column, marching back into Boston, they take shelter into the Jason Russell House. And it's part of one of the most significant portions because we actually have remnants of specific evidence of the British regulars firing onto the house. So we always get questions of, oh, is there a house, a standing house or witness house, we call it, that has a bullet hole from the battle? And I always tell people, as a matter of fact, I know one in particular, and we have about 12 or 13 or so. I apologize for this really quick. Let me just decline that. Being right next to the the phones right today. So um oh, I think that's just gonna keep on going.
Well, I'll just say real quick is, there's a house in Concord that has the bullet hole there by North Bridge, but if you want to see a house that's got bullet holes from April 19th, your house is the one to see. Just because there's so many, especially on the inside and just it kind of speaks to, like again, the savagery of what's going on that day and the violence that takes place once this action gets down in your neck of the woods around the Russell House. So how I know you guys have been doing a lot of research on this and some studies on where the shots were fired from. So are most of these shots that end up in the Russell House, are they coming from outside the Russell House? Are there any
Yeah.
British troops inside firing inside other parts of the house? What have you
So
guys determined by some of the research you guys have been working on?
absolutely. So we do know for a fact that there were so many other of these militiamen and Minutemen who unfortunately lost their lives outside of the Jason Russell House. So it wasn't just in this specific in the interior. We've recently done a ballistic study of with an individual named Joel Bowie. And he's done invited his team. He's getting his credentials up here for a second. He is with the director, he's the director of arms and militaria at Bruno and Company Auctions. And he's an expert in historical forensics and such. And him and his team, they came over to the Jason Russell House and they set up a whole bunch of little lasers and
Mm,
such and find remnants of gunpowder or lead or even specific examples of they measured the total width of the circumference, I suppose, of each hole and factored into the difference between a provincial musket ball, whether usually they would be varying sizes, because of course these were personal hunting muskets versus the British regulars, which had a specific musket ball size, which I'm
right.
blanking on specific circumference right now, but they measured that and figured that the if not most of them, if not all of them, were from the British regulars. And they actually found a lot more evidence of musket ball holes in the actual wood than what we have known. So
Oh,
um,
really? Wow.
they found a few more, and they within the first 10 minutes of them just staying there, there's one of the famous cellar, which I'll get to the story in a second, where right above it was the staircase leading up to the second floor, and you'll see two holes into the actual stairwell, which is from British regular musket balls. But if you turn around, you go into the cellar and turn around 180 degrees, and you look at the door frame, there's one right on the side of that that we have not known about, perhaps for almost 100 years now. So, and he found a couple other ones upstairs in the kitchen chamber and such. And there may be more that we don't even know about. But it's really interesting to see how the house has been preserved for so long. When we acquired it in the early 1920s, it was a house. So people were living there from, after 1775 to the early 1900s. And it's sort of interesting to see how they knew of the historical significance that they kept it because of course they could have modernized it and stripped everything off, but it's really cool that it stayed in place for so long. And so to talk about what happened specifically is the stories is that so many of these provincials and militiamen and Minutemen, they came into the house to seek shelter. And when you go into the front door, you're going to face the stairwell, as it's very tight, as most 18th century New England houses. And almost always, you might find the stairwell to the cellar basement would be right underneath, facing that same door. And so
Right.
the story is that the provincials, when they were seeking shelter, they ran into a wall thinking that there would be a stairwell to go hide into. And so as they're going into the house, they're stumbling over each other. And then they finally take a left into the kitchen where the access to the cellar is. And they go into the cellar facing upward up to the stairwell, close the door, of course, and point their muskets towards the door, just in case British regulars come. And there's instances when Jason Russell's wife eventually comes back after the battle, and she finds about 11 provincials and two British regulars, fortunately, their bodies in and around the kitchen area. So we can speculate that what happened was they sent two scouts into the house, and while they're hiding into the basement, they fired onto that doorway, killing two of those British regulars. And then afterwards, the British regulars then fired into the house, possibly killing those other remaining provincials. But of course, probably no one was there to live to see the actual story unfold. So a lot of it is stuff that we have from stories passed down from generation to generation. We have transcriptions from documents of people from witnesses, I suppose. So we do know a lot of the information that we have is definitely credible. And to put in perspective, I want to say very quickly, the highest number of provincial deaths that the most recent recording of provincial deaths that we have is roughly around 49 or 50 or so throughout the entire day. And people say, well, that's not a whole lot. And comparatively, I mean, there's just over 3,000 provincials versus 1,700 British regulars. So and out of those British regulars, about 73 of them were killed. And I'm not to mention, the about 200 more were wounded or missing or whatever. But and and that's the entire day in itself.
Right.
25 of those provincials died in Menotomy, and 40 of those British regulars died also in Menotomy. So when you see over half, if not half, of these soldiers, but on both sides, died just specifically in Menotomy. And if you break it down even further, we have 11 just inside the Jason Russell house, not accounting for it outside of the area, and 11 provincials and two British regulars. So to put in perspective, like that is a significant amount of the casualties that happen outside of the entire battle when you look at it on a broad scale.
Yeah, it's at near the end of the day too, right? This is like between
Yep.
5 and 6 o'clock, so it's getting later in the day, and you're obviously getting closer back into Boston. So there's a famous quote with Jason Russell, right? We got that question so many times on our tour. He says, "An Englishman's house is his castle," right? And he dies on the steps. Do we know how he died? I mean, I know he's shot a few times and he's bayoneted supposedly a bunch of times, but do we really know how he meets his end there at the house?
Yeah, we really don't. And we don't have this. So the story is that he was bayoneted on his doorstep. And that's something the story that has been passed down to. With this specific story, we don't have enough evidence to say and make that claim. So he may have passed in the general area. We do know he definitely did lose his life on April 19th, 1775. We just don't know for a fact whether or not he actually indeed will lose his life on his front doorstep, which of course is a story that is very tragic. And of course it's something that uh, would not be wanted in any sort.
Yeah, it was interesting. On our tour group, somebody went to the doorstep to get a picture. I had to tell them that the doorstep that's there now it was built after the war, correct? It's an addition to the front of the house. I said, actually, the doorstep that you're wanting to see probably would have been inside the building now.
Yeah, yeah.
So
So that's a really good point. So there's been a few additions to the house after the war. And we always say, like the Jason Russell house, like I mentioned before, again, it's been living by most of the Russell family, but also some other tenants. Um, they built onto the house, like they installed a an in-law suite sort of in the back right corner in the about the 1800s or so. Early 1800s, they installed that entryway.
right.
So as you mentioned, the house itself, if you look at it, there's this very small entryway that outcrops to the front of the house. Really, what we think is it would have been a flat surface rather than having that entryway. So if the Jason Russell's house or the Jason Russell story is in fact true, he may have died right where that specific walkway would have been, or where it is now.
Yeah, I mean it's yeah, just imagine coming home and finding not only your husband has been killed, but 11 more people laid out there in your kitchen is
Yeah,
you know, pretty crazy. I had to think about
yeah,
that.
absolutely. It's pretty traumatic.
Yeah. So yeah, so like I said, you guys are one of the last major actions before the British, go back into, well, actually don't go to the Canton, they go into Charlestown.
Mhm.
Um, so let's talk about what you guys are doing. Well, actually, before we do that, talk about a little bit about the Arlington Historical Society because you guys do a lot more on April
Yeah,
19th. I want to make sure you're able to tell our viewers because the history of the area is more on April 19th. Obviously, that's what we're focused on right now. But
absolutely.
what are some of the other things that you guys do other than the Jason Russell House?
Yeah, what's unique about us is we have a huge historically significant event that happened here, but we interpret the history on a broad sense. So the Arlington Historical Society was founded in about 1897. Technically, it's about 1888, 1898. And the idea was to collect objects of antiquity, like manuscripts, images, objects, you name it, just sort of to collect it. Not necessarily for historic preservation at this point, but just to more for entertainment purposes. And probably starting out, it may have been just on the Revolutionary War things and such, but eventually it turned into a society that would preserve the historical significance of the house. And when we acquired it in 1920, 1923, technically, um, to rather than just interpreting the Revolutionary War stories, interpreting Arlington or West Cambridge or Menotomy, where the town that has changed its name three different times, and go on a much broader scale because there's a lot of rich history in Arlington. There's the story of the guy Uncle Sam was allegedly he was born here. Allegedly. There's also other stories of, and I haven't been able to verify this, but the invention of the Excel spreadsheet may have been invented here.
I'll not be proud of that.
Right. I know I wouldn't flop that, but
No,
but
but significant. No, you're right.
yes,
Significant.
and so we like to show off and sort of interpret the different aspects of Arlington history. Obviously, with the 250th anniversary of the battle coming up, we are planning lots for special exhibitions, but we also have instances of prehistory. We're actually doing research, and we've had a mastodon tusk that was found in Spy Pond, which is the local pond nearby. And the story is someone probably around the 50s or so was fishing off a Spy Pond and found this mastodon tusk preserved in the set. And there's a lot of questions as to it's not necessarily age anymore, but where it came from. Was it actually from the Boston area, or did someone have it and then just toss it into Spy Pond? Because there's a lot of unopened answers about that. But we found that when we carbon dated it back in the 80s or so, it was dated to about 43,000 years old. Now, the most recent one that we've done is actually 47,000 years old, even older than, of course, than we originally thought. So again, in short, it's not just the revolutionary history, which is, of course, a huge significant of what we do. However, again, this was a house that was lived in for hundreds of years. And we like to talk about the progression of not just the house, but the progression of the town in itself.
Right. And it's changed a lot, right? Obviously, since 1775, like many suburban areas of urban areas around the country have changed a lot. Well, with that being said, you do have a lot coming up in April.
Yes, yeah.
So, understand that you all do a lot more than just Revolutionary War history, but really the focus coming up here soon this spring, I'm assuming not just for your place, but also all the different organizations are involved up and down the April 19th story. What do you guys have planned for the anniversary coming up?
Yeah.
And also after that, if you could talk about if people were to come visit, what would you recommend that they would come and see?
Yeah, absolutely. So I got my cheat sheet of specific dates right next to me. So in short, we're releasing a program, uh, I guess a program called Untold Stories. And the idea is the Battle of Menotomy and the Battle of the Jason Russell House is not something that a lot of people know about. It's not something that's really taught in history books or anything like that. And so we want to, this is a really good opportunity for us to sort of almost get us on the map and allow us to share our history and share our narratives and the research that we've done to a much broader audience. We are an integral part of the Arlington community, and we're going to take this opportunity for the 250th to really revamp a lot of things, like our website, like a lot of our policies and our plans and such, and get us to perform on a organizational on a higher standard in that sense. But for program wise, we always do an annual lecture series. And we have a few different lectures coming up from very knowledgeable people. Actually, this December, Tuesday, December 3rd, we are going to have a lecture on the history of spinning and the role of spinning in textile making for the American Revolution, but also the Industrial Revolution, but also how people spin and create these textiles today, where it's a living art. And then we also have coming up a few other ones, but I want to highlight another one by a retired Major General. His name is Major General William Rapp. He is an expert in military history, and specifically in British 18th century British history, military history. And so on Tuesday, March 25th, at 2025 at 7:30, he will be giving a talk about a soldier's life, what it was like to be a provincial and British regular soldier on April 19th, 1775. So we talked a little bit about that before, but he really wants to dive in, sort of give everyone that perspective of what it really was like to be
Right.
present on that day. But our big 250th celebration coming up, this is actually going to be May 17th after the whole reenactments, which I'll get to in a second. But we're going to have a huge event coming here on the lawn of the Jason Russell House. We're going to have morning art shows. We're going to have with continental breakfasts and everything. We're going to have a ticket program with a conservation architect. His name is Eric Radoya, to give a talk and tour and just be there for answer questions and such about the phases of the Jason Russell House. We're going to have, of course, those architectural tours. We're going to have every summer we have a beer garden out in the lawn. That's a big community engagement thing. We usually have a band play and everything, so it's a lot of fun. So people come over here and just hang out, have a beer or whatever, listen to music. And we're going to do something right next to the town hall in that sense. So if that's May 17th. But specifically, and I think a lot of people are really hoping for specifically on April 19th, Patriots Day. On April 19th, we'll be celebrating with the passage of Paul Revere and William Dawes as they make their way through Menotomy. And then a little bit later on Sunday, April 20th, is when the actual reenactment of the battle is going to occur. We don't have specifics as to the time in that sense, but we just know that's where we have a pretty action-packed plan for that entire weekend.
That's a crazy weekend, right?
Yeah. And I will say very quickly, in addition to that, in addition to this whole untold stories, we're going to be unveiling a special exhibition, which will be open for this season. And it's going to be different topics as, of course, the Battle of Menotomy is an untold story, but also the different perspectives and different pieces of history in that sense. So we're going to talk about and unveil objects from enslaved people in the 18th century, women and their role with spinning and spinning bees in particular. But also, we're also going to talk about centennial celebrations. How did people celebrate? How do we celebrate the centennial or the bicentennial or the 250th throughout these historical landmarks?
That's pretty cool. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting to see the differences, what we're going to do today versus what we did back in 1975. So,
Yeah, the bicentennial was big, right? I
yeah.
mean, some of the things that they did, a lot of money was spent.
Yes.
Um, so, all right, I'm gonna put you in the spot real quick before we're done. Top three places to go if you want to learn more about April 19th.
Yes, so I enjoy the Concord Museum quite a lot, and sort of similar to what we do, and it has more exhibition galleries. They have special exhibitions. Then I know that they're planning on something for the 250th, of course, as well. But they have an excellent April 19th gallery,
Yep.
which talks about the road leading to the Revolution, but also again, sort of the same thing with the centennial celebrations, the Minuteman statue and the creation of that. And they give a great display of the entire day and veils, and it's a giant map video that shows you exactly the lines in which the British regulars go out, in which the provincials go out. They tell you the story of Paul Revere, all within about 6 minutes or so.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's very
Right.
digestible. So it's something that I appreciate quite a bit. The other thing, of course, I love the Old North Bridge area, and same thing as you mentioned with the Battle Road. So if you're coming into Concord and you're coming into Concord, Lexington, and Boston, you might as well go see the National Park Services and areas because they're working really hard to revamp the entire area.
Right.
They're looking to get the trails in better condition. They're trying to sort of do a lot of forest management in that area to really make it a little bit more historically accurate, but also just better for the average visitor. They have a great it's a very small museum gallery with a couple of replica soldier uniforms. They have one of the cannons that the provincials got leading up to April 19th. And the entire area is actually quite beautiful as in the bridge itself. And then of course the Buckman Tavern with the Lexington Historical Society is sort of a must as well. This was the area where, of course, Sam Adams and John Hancock and a couple others, I suppose, met that evening of April 18th before everything happened. And that's where the 60 militiamen, they blockaded the road for the British regulars going into Concord. So I hopefully if you guys come out to this area, hopefully you can put us on the map, but also I highly recommend checking out all these other places that interpret the story of April 19th and such.
No, that's a great list. I mean, it really is. I mean, you hit Lexington, hit the North Bridge, hit the Concord Museum, which is a fantastic museum. Obviously, the National Park Service site, but I think really the Jason Russell House really kind of brings it home more of a personal level to people because we all have families, in one way, shape, or we all live someplace, right? We can kind of relate to what would happen if that happened around our home or where we live, right? So it brings in that civilian story, which I think is so important when it comes to April 19th, because these militiamen, they're civilians, right? For the most part. I mean, they do become members of the military later on, right? When they form the Continental Army, but it really tells you that it brings home that civilian story. And I think that's a great angle for you all because, the April 19th story is so much about the common civilians in that area that obviously had a role in what happened, but in so many cases of warfare across the world, even today, civilians are caught in the crossfire and become, casualties, out of just bad luck or a bad situation or being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Yeah.
And so, and you have physical evidence of that, right? It's not just a historic house where you can say 11 people laid out here on the floor. You can actually point to your visitors and show them those bullet holes. And that, I mean, I saw that with the group we brought up there. It really brought the whole story home. So I think it's
Yeah.
a great place to visit, to cap off any visit to April 19th is your museum. So
Yeah.
high kudos to you guys for
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, everyone loves the bullet holes.
I know, I know.
I mean, it's cool. It's
I mean, the
cool.
clock is cool too. Don't get me wrong,
Yeah.
the clock there in the doorway is cool, but just that story is
Yeah.
really resonates with people, I think. So
Yeah.
um well, hey, thank you, Matt. Thanks for being here. And again, if well, what's your website? I know you said you're updating your website, but
Yeah.
is the website going to change or are you going to keep the same?
So it's the same domain, so arlingtonhistorical.org.
Okay. Obviously, if you Google Jason Russell House, will pop up. The social media pops up. So, for those who are watching, those who go to Boston next year or go to Boston anytime, check out the museum. It's fantastic. And thank you, Matt, for being here. And we'll see everyone next time. Take care.